was the first time that a news story made you feel scared? Was it a local problem or a national one? Do you now think that that worry was justified? Or was it an example of a moral panic? A specter of fear conjured out of news cycles and rumors. In the late 1800s, a swirl of sensational headlines created what has retroactively been described as the first moral panic. And through this story, we're able to see how the news is both able to document and create the culture that it studies. England in the mid-1800s was literally Dickensian. Like, literally, that's when Dickens was writing his novels. The Industrial Revolution and Irish potato famine had led to this huge uptick in crime and poverty. But one of the most popular types of violent crime at this point is this thing called garrotting, where like one guy would grab you with his elbow and the other would like just take your wallet. It had the wonderful euphemism of putting the hug on. I want to mention that like in this mid-1850s time, it's actually really hard to get any real crime statistics, but from what we can tell, crime had been going steadily down since the introduction of the police and like street lights in the mid-1820s. But regardless, by the 1850s, most people in England would have considered London to just be this like no-go zone, something that would certainly never get blown out of proportion today. And so in 1856, seeing the fears of like the nation, these newspapers started running these stories claiming that there was this huge uptick in violent crime. This first wave of like mugging paranoia stories are pretty garden variety, honestly. It's just like these work-shy savages that are coming out of the slums and they're gonna get you. This is, pretty boring for Victoria, England. That's like just an average Tuesday. And the newspapers knew this because they started to phase these stories out in 1857 because they're like, the public is just going to get bored with this if it wasn't for what happened next. July 17, 1862. British Member of Parliament for Blackburn, James Pilkington, is returning home from a late night sitting in the House of Commons. Around 1 a.m., two shadowy figures emerge from the darkness as James walks down Pall Mall Street in London. One of the pair reaches around and starts choking the MP, while the other rifles through his coat until he finds and rips out his pocket watch. As James Pilkington gasps for air and the attackers run away with his watch, little do any of them know that they have started one of the greatest outrages in British history. This story set off the panic full steam. You had the perfect scenario, perfect celebrity victim, and the perfect situation. And this was going to sell some paper, and sell some pape it did. After this point, every single crime in London was just going to be written up as an attempted mugging. Some old lady lost her keys, mugging. Drunken squabble, mugging. And if there wasn't anything to like even misconstrue as a mugging, just lie. Just say that there was. It doesn't matter. But the Times likely had the best single encapsulation of like the zeitgeist of this event whenever they wrote, the whole of this great and most expensive judicial hierarchy seems to be established solely for catching thieves and letting them go again. And just like today, this moral panic started reflecting itself in all the same ways that like a moral panic would today. These humor magazines where they would show these like absurd outfits that supposedly people would be buying, which was itself a parody of very real items that people really were buying, like these really stiff collars that had like razor blades or something that would allegedly protect you from getting mugged. And also, just like today, you had the great ability to bring out the worst in society because every single newspaper was pushing these xenophobic lies that like this was obviously some foreign influence coming into England. No true British highwayman would have resulted to the garret. There's stories from this period where like groups of people will think that like the other is a mugger and they'll just start attacking them. There was even a like, what about the children part of this. Kids would be imitating like the elbow hug thing and like parents would be losing their minds about this. The really scary part of this public fear was the real life letters that got written into these newspapers calling for like the return of transportation. And so with their constituency telling them this is what we want, the legal system responded. In 1863, they restored flogging for those convicted of violent robbery. In 1864, 3 and 4 year jail sentences were abolished and replaced by 5-year minimum terms. They also started redefining some minor offenses as more severe crimes. And once you were convicted, prison was deliberately made worse with this theme of hard fare, hard bed, and hard work. Prisoners were deliberately kept from communicating with each other, they were given much worse food, and they were given these tasks that were deliberately pointless and painful to do, like passing cannonballs back and forth or running on a treadmill, and not the kind that you would run on today either. I think that it's very important to note that like none of these reforms like actually reduced poverty or like made the streets safer. They were just there to punish these imaginary villains. And the real life effects meant that it punished hundreds of thousands of people for longer and harder. In fact, these policies well outlived the panic. The next year, the newspapers had moved on to more interesting stories, but these reforms affected people's lives for decades afterward, undoing years of reform in the process. But just like today, laws reflect what we talk about when we talk about what's interesting, and what's interesting is not always true. But for another step into the bizarre past, watch this video over the Leicester balloon riot.